Hello and welcome to History with Mr. E. Now, today we're going to talk some more about the Allies and the Axis powers in Germany. We're actually going to cut the first chapter or section of chapter 20 into two pieces, so you don't have to read 20.2, just complete 20.1 because it's a very long section. We'll start with 20.2 on Monday. On September 3rd, 1939, the Allied powers formed. They were France and Great Britain, and they declared war on Germany and the Axis powers. Remember, the Axis powers were Italy and Germany. Hitler went on with his blitzkriegs and conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. By May of 1940, Hitler marched on Paris, and Paris peacefully surrendered in June of 1940 without a fight. On June 10th, Mussolini invaded and took southern France. So France had basically fallen to the Nazis. The French actually had a government they called the Vichy government. It was formed in Vichy, France, of people that worked with the Nazis. They said they did it to keep people safe and to make peace, but they were just the cowards that wanted to keep themselves from having to fight against this terrible, terrible Nazi power. Only Great Britain was left. And Great Britain had put up a brave fight in France, but had to flee to Great Britain because they knew that Hitler wanted nothing more than to conquer the islands, the British Isles. And for 3 months, he bombed Great Britain to soften up Great Britain and London, especially for invasion. This was called the Blitz, the Great Blitz that happened, and it was a very terrible, terrible time for Great Britain. But here's the thing: the British Air Force was so good that they were shooting down any German planes just one after the other when they would try, because remember, Great Britain is an island, and they couldn't get the armies of Germany to that island, so they bombed them for months and months to soften them up so that they could make that invasion. And the British pilots were so good that they were shooting down all the German pilots, so Germans would only attack at night. So they would bomb at night, and the Brits would come out of their houses and move away the rubble and clean up their city during the day. The Prime Minister of Great Britain at the beginning of the war and throughout till the end of the war was Winston Churchill. He begged the United States to come and fight, but the United States wanted to isolate themselves from the problems in Europe. They wanted to strengthen America and do something called Fortress America. This was thought of by Charles Lindbergh, who was notoriously anti-war. And understandably anti-war. The United States did send weapons and food to Great Britain, but we formally remained neutral. We began to protect with our warships any shipping convoys that were going to Great Britain with supplies. And we would even fire on German subs to quote unquote protect ourselves. But really, we were pretty much out of the war. The U.S. and British, however, had cleared the Germans completely out of the sky by 1940. The German Air Force was ineffective. We had much, much superior airplanes. In 1940, amazingly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the only third term by any U.S. president. But this was since he went out of office, they created an amendment to the Constitution that allows no more than 2 terms as president. FDR began building up in 1940 our military and our weapons. He called it the Great Arsenal of Democracy. He also began loaning big money to the Allies to purchase U.S. weapons and our food to supply them. This ended the Depression because the economy went nuts after this. All kind of money was rolling in. We were able to rebuild our economy because the factories were working at full force building weapons, building airplanes, building tanks, building jeeps, and we were sending loads of food, loads of weapons to the Russians later on in the war, to Great Britain to help out what was left of the Free French armies, and all over the world. And then Hitler makes his greatest mistake. On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler got cocky and invaded Russia. Russia was powerful. The communists were powerful and motivated, and Hitler started to think of them as a threat. And he invaded Russia, and now Russia became an ally of Great Britain and France and the United States. The U.S. sent billions and billions of dollars in weapons and supplies to Russia. Germany and Russia entered into heavy combat in Russia, and Russia kept Hitler from taking massive oil fields, and the Nazis couldn't get fuel. The Baku oil fields were stopped. Their invasion and conquer of the Baku oil fields was stopped by the Russians, and then the Germans couldn't get fuel. Why did the Germans lose the war? Most likely because they ran out of gas. They ran out of gas in Africa, they ran out of gas in Europe, and if you don't have gas to move your tanks and your airplanes, then the weapons of war are stuck where they're at, and they're able to move freely. At this time, the United Nations, the original United Nations called the Atlantic Charter, was formed, and good relations with Latin America were formed between the U.S. and Europe. And we promised to consult Latin America before any warfare in the Caribbean, South or Central America. Latin America joined the Allied cause. Now, they didn't send big armies or anything, but they were definitely against the Axis powers. In 1937, Japan decided to get in on the war, and they invaded China, and the U.S. cut off all aid and oil to Japan. Japan got greedy. They invaded China and did terrible, terrible, terrible atrocities in Nanking, China, especially. Now, don't think that the Chinese hadn't done terrible things in wars against Japan, but the invasion of Nanking will go down in history as one of the worst sets of war crimes ever. In 1940, Japan allied with the communists, the Russians, not even the Russians, golly, they allied with the Nazis and in Italy and reformed the Axis powers stronger than ever before. Now look, guys, before the war was basically based in Europe, and now it's based in Europe and in the Pacific Ocean, China, Japan, and all those little islands like Vietnam and the Philippines. They're getting awful close to America. There's nothing but the Pacific Ocean between America and war, and nothing but the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and America and war. The Japanese Minister of War was named Hideki Tojo. The Japanese needed oil. They wanted it from Indonesia. They decided that they had to destroy the U.S. naval presence in the Pacific first to do that. On December 7th, 1941, in the morning, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, completely took the United States Navy by surprise. The U.S. Navy, or the United States, actually had Japanese diplomats trying to negotiate a peace between U.S. and Japan in America at the time, and it was all a ruse to put us off of our guard to attack, and they did. They bombed and torpedoed Pearl Harbor for 2 hours, and the U.S. lost several ships. The United States, or the USS Arizona, was sunk with 1,000 men on board. We lost 18 ships, 8 of which were battleships. 170 airplanes and 3,500 sailors and soldiers were killed or wounded. Japan then declared war on the United States and Great Britain, and the United States answered in kind on December 8th, 1941, at war with Japan, and 3 days later Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and we're in the war. Winston Churchill poured himself a drink that day and stated that the war was won because the U.S. was in the war. On Monday, we'll talk about 20.2. Have a good weekend.